Yeah, I won't be singing because I'm told it could cause wailing and gnashing of teeth, and I don't want to bring the four horsemen of the apocalypse early. So we won't be doing that. But I will be giving a talk on, is Christianity anti-science or anti-scientific? If you're like me, you grew up hearing this day in and day out. I remember in 3rd grade, I was told how the oppressive Christian church in the 14 and 1500s taught the earth was flat. And they tried to prevent Christopher Columbus from going across the Atlantic because he was going to sail off the edge of the earth. Or I heard that, Christians are holding back science at every turn. None of that is true. There was a lot of misconceptions about what's going on. And we're going to cover a lot of them. I hope that when you leave tonight, you're going to be well equipped with a lot of great information to combat this. And if anybody, of course, wants the slides from this presentation, you just go to my website, inspiringphilosophy.org, and I will email you the slides. It's very quite simple. So as I said, if you're like me, you grew up with this kind of crap. Religion versus science. Religion is holding back science. I love the graph in the top corner because it's like, look everyone, the Egyptians, followed by the Greeks, then the Romans, everything was going great, and then the Christian Dark Ages happened. And then it was horrible for 1,000 years until the Renaissance came, and then the Age of Enlightenment, and then modern science. So if you think about it, as this thing says, Christianity, just think, we could be exploring the galaxy by now. If Christianity wasn't holding us back, we would have been so much more advanced, but they ushered in the Dark Ages. Well, now, a lot of people go beyond just mere memes, because there's no evidence cited here. This is all just rhetoric. But those cite things like this. This was from Pew Research, and it says that, look at general public versus scientists. 83% of the general public believe in God, but only 33% of scientists do. 41% don't believe in God, and that's only 4% of the general public. So if more of the general public was atheist or was not religious, just think about how much more science would be. If Christians were really advancing science, they would be better represented in science, wouldn't they? So, for example, there's a guy named Jerry Coyne, famous biologist. He wrote this article, and he wrote a book. The article is, yes, there is a war between science and religion. And he goes on this big, long rant. One quote I want to pull out from there is where he says this: there is a huge disparity in religiosity between American scientists and Americans as a whole. 64% of our elite scientists are atheists or agnostics, compared to only 6% of the general population, more than a tenfold difference. Whether this reflects differential attraction of non-believers to science, or science eroding belief, my favorite part, I suspect both factors operate. The figures are prima facie evidence for a science-religion conflict. So the fact that there are so little religious people, Christians, in science is evidence for a science-religion conflict. Now, I wanted to point, he actually has a source here. There's a hyperlink there. If you click on the hyperlink, this is a source he takes you to. Now, I'm sure most people haven't read this book, but I have. So when I clicked on the hyperlink, I was confused because I've read this book already when I read his article. And this book does not support what he's saying whatsoever. Let me just quote from it. Here's what the two researchers say in their book. They say, after 5 years of research, here's what we know. Religious Americans of all types are interested and appreciate science. They are open to accepting new narratives concerning the origin and development of life on Earth. They are not inherently hostile to environmentalism or technological process. So his own source is not really supporting what he's saying. Here are some graphs. Now, it's kind of hard to read. I'm sorry about that. Kelly needs to get a bigger screen, but we're stuck with what we got here. But this is basically perception of relationship between religion and science. What this graph is basically showing is that most religious, evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, Catholics, Jews, even non-Western religions, they're in the bottom category there, and they don't say there is a conflict between religion and science. And the overwhelming majority of religious people don't think that. They also do another thing. They talk about origin narratives. And what people like Jerry Coyne want to say is that Christians want to teach one specific origin narrative. Well, according to their survey, most Christians are open to different origin narratives. They're not nailed down to one. They're not all young earth creationists. They're not all trying to fight science or say, it's got to be this certain way. They're open to saying, it could be different. Maybe our interpretation could be off, things like that. Also interesting, do you think science does more harm than good? Well, overwhelming majority of Christians say that science does more good than harm. They're not saying science is bad or is eroding things away. It doesn't really support his notion here. Now, they also cite this. This is an interesting quote. They cite another study. They say Evans found no real difference between religious groups and non-religious groups when it comes to knowledge of uncontested scientific facts, or in their understanding of the scientific method, their likelihood of having been a science major in college, or their likelihood of currently working in a scientific occupation. So this study that they're citing noted there is no difference between religious and non-religious when it comes to understanding science, having scientific knowledge, or working in science. So their own research doesn't support the atheist or Jerry Coyne's argument that religious Americans are opposed to science or they're fighting against it. It doesn't really show that. They seem to be represented just fine among scientists so far. Now, they do note this in the book. This is where Jerry Coyne is getting his information from, because with every lie, there's a bit of truth in it. They did note that among academic scientists, 11% of chemists doubt God exists, whereas 27% of chemists don't think God exists. So same with biologists. 7% of biologists think God exists, 40% do not. Compared to the general population, it is much more. So 63% of U.S. adults, according to their survey, think God exists. Only 2% do not think God exists. So it does appear that a lot of scientists in an academic setting doubt God exists versus the general public. However, that's just one piece of it. They said, well, let's not just look at scientists in academia. Let's look at scientists abroad. Let's include anyone who has a scientific field. We'll include medical doctors, people that have physics degrees that are engineers, and we'll see the broad survey of people with scientific training. What do they say? Well, according to their survey, rank and file scientists versus all respondents. So the first column is rank and file scientists. The second is the general population. They're saying, well, how many are evangelical Protestant? Well, the numbers are almost the same. So of evangelical Protestants that are scientists, it's 21%. Compared to the general population, 24%. Mainline Protestants, it's 26% among scientists, 30% of the general population. So very similar when you include all rank and file scientists, not just scientists in academia. You actually get very close to the general population there. It's not as bad as, you make it out when you only pick the academic scientists. When you include broad research in the broad fields, you get much more interesting numbers that are more general to the population. So what do scientists think? Do they feel that there is religion is trying to hold back their scientific work? Well, Eklund, one of the study authors that I was citing earlier, she wrote another book recently. She looked at the opinions of scientists on a global scale. She said a substantial majority of scientists do not believe that religion and science are intrinsically in conflict with one another. These are her results from UK and US. Most scientists, especially in the US, do not think religion and science are in conflict. So this one graph over here to the left is the UK, the next one is the US. Over 50% of scientists say that in the US say that religion and science are independent. They're not in conflict, they're just studying different areas. Some, 12% say in the US, say they collaborate, they work together. Only 28% or so say they're actually in conflict or so, or 29% I guess. So it's not so much that scientists think that religion is sort of like against what they're doing. Okay, Jerry Coyne is very much in the minority when he claims there's a religion-science conflict. Most scientists don't agree with him. So here's what, going back to the Scheidel and Eklund's book, she says, surveys of professors more broadly reveal that professors in humanities, so think art history, English, and social sciences are just as irreligious as those of the natural sciences. So what Eklund and Scheidel are saying is that when we look at in academia, it seems that religious people, Christians, they're also underrepresented in academia, in history, in English, in art history, in the humanities in general. Do you think that is evidence religion, or specifically Christianity, is at war with English or art history? Anyone think there's a war between science and English or art history? No. Also, I want to pull you to this. This is a survey of scientists broken down by gender and race. If you zoom in, women, you are underrepresented in the scientific fields. Very far. Why are you at war with science? Ladies, minorities are underrepresented in science. Why are you at war with science? Now remember, Jerry Coyne got to say that because religious individuals are low in science, that means there's evidence of a war there. There's such low numbers. But there's such low numbers of women in science, that must prove women are at war with science. Am I right? Ladies? No. Yeah. All right, I'm just making sure. Because Jerry Coyne said if there's low numbers in science, it means there's a war going on. So, I'm going to keep an eye on you all, just saying. But it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to say that just because a certain group of people are underrepresented in the field, it means they're at war with it. Maybe, just maybe, there are other factors at play. I know, who would have thunk it?
Ludicrous.
Ludicrous, exactly. But so maybe there are other factors at play. So why would Christians be underrepresented in science? Have any scientists actually studied this? Well, yes, that's what we're about to get to, of course. So, as we said, yeah, it does appear in academia Christians are underrepresented, religious people in general. Even when you do rank and file scientists, there still seems to be more atheist agnostics in it compared to the general population. So it says here that 24% of rank and file scientists are atheist, agnostic, or unaffiliated, compared to only 60% of the general population. So they still seem to have a slight advantage there. But why? Well, some researchers have looked into this. Instead of saying, are Christians biased against science, some have asked the question, are scientists biased against Christians? Interesting idea to look at. Well, this specific paper was done at Arizona State University. Sorry if anybody went to the U of A here, but this was done at Arizona State University, but I'm going to cite it anyway, so you're just going to have to suffer through it. So they did 3 studies. Study 1, Study 2, and Study 3 in the whole paper. In Study 2, they asked, would you consider a president of a Christian or an atheist or another club as likable, competent, and hireable? Now, as you can see, the green is the Christian, the gray is the atheist, and the light beigeish yellow is just another club member. You can see the Christian is the lowest, but it's within a margin of error in the study. So no bias against Christians was found in Study 2. Now you notice I skipped over Study 1 because in Study 1, bias against Christians was found. They said, we found that college science students report a perceived bias against Christians in science, and that evangelical Christians perceive greater bias than Catholic and non-Christian students. So within the scientific field, a lot of students and professors are reporting there is bias against Christians. In Study 3, same thing was found. Biology professors, they were asked to rate someone who was who worked for Campus Crusade. Would you rate them as hireable, competent? And most biology professors did rate the Christian student less hireable, less competent, less likable than someone who wasn't. So they basically pointed out there is bias against Christians in the scientific community, in academia. Now, it's just one study, though. I mean, have anyone else found any similar research? Yes. So more research. So there is documented bias against Christians among scientists, as we pointed out with this study. Additionally, Christians tend to be more attracted to helping professions in health, medicine, and engineering fields. So a lot of Christians feel they want to go into more helping fields than actually teaching at universities. It's not so much that they're against science, it's just they feel more attracted to go into different areas. Also, Christian parents are encouraging this. They're encouraging their young ones to not become professors or study science directly, but go into a field where you're going to help people directly. That's going to create lower numbers of Christians in academia because they're not drawn to them, and their own families are not encouraging it. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a good thing to go into more helping fields. So, but it's not the idea that their parents are telling their kids, don't go to academia because we hate science. That's not what's going on. As I said, other factors are at play. Christians can be negatively stereotyped about their ability to work in science, and when Christians have been shown to be aware of this negative stereotype, they underperform in assessment tests on science. So, according to this study, Christians are being negatively stereotyped. And then, if the Christian is aware of it, they're underperforming in science. And if you're like me, when you were in high school, when I underperformed in a field, I didn't want to study it further because it's discouraging. You don't really want to do that. So, what's funny is Jerry Coyne and a lot of atheist scientists are creating this positive feedback loop. Christians can't be good in science, and that's presenting a stereotype out there that's causing a lot of Christians to go, well, I guess I can't do science then because I'm not good at it. So it's creating this positive feedback loop to confirm what they already want. So if you go back to Ecklund and Scheitel's book, they cite this. They say 49% of religious scientists at elite universities feel their scientific colleagues do not view religion positively. One physicist said, I think universities are not always very accepting environments. It is really hard to be religious and to be a religious academic because the public opinion is such that you're either religious or you're a scientist. To say that you're religious might mean other scientists would question your work. So here, they're interviewing this one physicist, and he's saying, look, I'm religious, but I don't want to tell anyone because they're not going to want to work with me. My work's going to be discredited. There's this perceived bias among scientists, according to all this research. I have more research. Of course I do. Evangelicals are significantly more likely to report workplace religious discrimination. 43% of Protestant academic biologists report that they have been discriminated against in the workplace because of their religion. And also, in 2021, so just this year, it was found that religiosity is positively associated with concealment of religious identity, which is itself negatively associated with identification as a scientist. However, I also want to note, this does not mean that these scientists thought their religion made them less competent as scientists. They just felt that there was a perception that if they're religious, it's going to make them appear to be less scientific, but they didn't think their actual religion made them less competent. They just felt that's the perceived bias they're getting. So, why are Christians underrepresented in science? I mean, honestly, if you want me to say it, they don't want Christians in science, apparently. There's this perceived bias, and they're trying to put out the stereotype that Christians are not good at science, they're not competent, you can't be a scientist and Christian. So people like Jerry Coyne, Richard Dawkins, are creating this positive feedback loop. They say Christians or people that hold a religion can't do science. That goes out to the general public. It's shared among everybody, and now Christians feel they can't go into science. And that's just not me saying it. That's what the research is saying. Take it up with the study authors if you don't agree. So. But we all know Christians on the general public are against science, aren't they? They're not open to learning new things, right? We all know religion makes people closed-minded, right? That's what we're told. Well, let's look at this. There was a study that was on. Well, first of all, I almost forgot about this one. There's a study that was done called Are Atheists on Prejudice? They were saying if atheists display prejudice. Now, if most scientists at an academic university are atheists, there's a correlation there. What this study found was that atheists and agnostics showed prejudicial discriminatory attitudes towards anti-liberals, but also towards mere Christians, and atheists did also towards Buddhists. This prejudice also included unwillingness to have anti-liberal and religiousists even as neighbors. So these atheists, this was done in the UK, France, and Spain. They didn't even want people with a religion to be their neighbors. So there was not just prejudice, there was discriminatory attitudes. They didn't even want them as neighbors. So it's pretty, so I mean, most scientists at academic universities are atheists or agnostic. We can also make a correlation to the fact that this study found there is prejudice among atheists themselves. So again, it's not just coming from one angle. You can look at it from scientists who have bias against Christians, but also atheists in general seem to have prejudice against Christians, Buddhists, other religious groups, whatnot. So, are Christians closed-minded? Are religious people closed-minded? Well, let's talk about this. In psychology, your personality is divided into 5 parts in psychological studies. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. The acronym is OCEAN. So, OCEAN. Now, openness, this is what we're going to look at in a minute. It's observed when a subject is more willing to try new things and be open to new ideas. Pretty good. We all want to be like that. Conscientiousness refers to a positive trait, being mindful of others. So, if you're really concerned about other people, you want to help a lot, you're very conscientious. Extroversion refers to being more outgoing and willing to create more friendships. Okay, another good thing that we should all want to do. Now, this is not the introvert-extroversion scale that a lot of people fall on. This is sort of a little bit different in the studies. Introverts can be extroverted according to this scale. They're willing to be open and help people, and you know what I mean. Agreeableness refers to altruistic and pro-social behaviors. Neuroticism is the one thing you don't want your personality to correlate. So you want to be correlating with the top 4. The bottom one you don't want to correlate with. Neuroticism refers to a personality that experiences a lot of stress and anxiety. You're probably a little neurotic if you have kids. You'll know what that means now. High amounts of this trait, you tend to experience irritability and mood swings. Again, if you have kids, I understand. We're all a little neurotic sometimes. So, now there was a study done. This was a meta-analysis. Now, if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, a meta-analysis is not its own study. What it does is it draws every study on the subject. So if you want to look at, like, there's been meta-analysis done on religion and crime, and it looked at like some 60-some studies on religion and crime to find the overall trend. This one looked at a bunch of studies on religion and affecting these 5 personality traits. Did they find that religion correlated with a lack of openness? Well, it depends on what type of religion. So this is the chart. The top one is general intrinsic religiosity. The second one is mature religiosity. The next one is fundamentalism. And the bottom one is extrinsic religiosity. Now, the real one is the top one we're going to look at. Now, I'm sorry, it's really small. They did not find any significant correlation between a lack of openness, i.e. closed-mindedness, and religiosity. It was within the margin of error. So it's basically 0%. They did not correlate. But if you would be defined as a mature religious individual, which means you understand your religious doctrines, you have religious coping mechanisms, you could be able to explain your religion well. That correlated pretty high with openness. Also with extroversion, also with agreeableness, also with conscientiousness, and negatively correlated with neuroticism. If you're just generally religious, correlates with extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, did not correlate with neuroticism, and did not correlate with openness. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad to didn't correlate with openness. It just means there was no relation. It means religion wasn't creating openness or prohibiting it. It was just sort of like unrelated entirely. So within the margin of error, correlates up to 0%. But if you're mature in your religion, you correlated with extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness on a pretty high margin, and you negatively correlate with neuroticism. So when people say religion makes you closed-minded, the studies don't show that. The meta-analysis, look at all the studies on the subject, did not find that religiosity makes people closed-minded, didn't show that it made them neurotic, it did not show it made them less conscientious, less agreeable, less extroverted. So where did we get this idea that religion makes people closed-minded or unwilling to be open to new ideas? Scheidel and Eklund's surveys didn't show that. It showed that a lot of Christians are open to new ideas about origins and scientific theories, and they're not against it. So this research helps confirm that. So, but we all know, haven't Christians held back science for centuries? Remember this? So, we're told, Christians taught the earth was flat. Christians held back science. They burned scientists at the stake. They imprisoned Galileo, and they forced him into submission to teach the idea the sun or the earth did not go around the sun. Oh, I heard this stuff in third grade. Third grade in Pennsylvania, I was being taught this crap. I was being taught in fourth, fifth, you name it. So, here are some modern myths I want to go over today. I'm not going to be able to get to them all. There's a lot of modern myths out there. We'll cover a couple here. So, the church fought against scientific progress at every step of the way. It wasn't until the Enlightenment that science really was able to be free. The medieval church taught the earth was flat, and they tried to prevent Christopher Columbus from sailing west because he was going to fly off the edge of the earth, according to some people. Christians burned the Great Library of Alexandria. How many have heard of the Great Library of Alexandria? Yes, it was this ancient library in Alexandria, Egypt. It had all the knowledge of the world. It had close to 500,000 scrolls at one point. And one day those evil Christians just couldn't, they hated learning, and man, they went and they burned it. They just hated learning. And of course, Christians fought against science because it contradicted the biblical date for the age of the earth at 6,000 years. So I was just reading a book for one of my classes. A researcher named Christopher Boehm opened his book up. He's writing a book on moral origins, but he couldn't help but opening his book by saying, everyone believed the earth was 6,000 years until Darwin came along. Again, that's not true either. So these are some myths. Again, this is one of my favorite graphs I've seen all over the internet. I've made it bigger here. But yeah, Christianity. Just think, we could be exploring the galaxy by now. You have Egypt, then Greece, then Rome, then the Christian Dark Ages. And they stopped all progress the Romans had made. Then the Renaissance came, then the Age of Enlightenment, then modern science. But could you imagine if Christianity didn't get control? We'd be exploring the galaxy by now. All sorts of amazing things. So we're going to go through these. There's a lot of problems here, and I hope to dispel some of these myths tonight. So first of all, there was a great book. I got a copy here. It's Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. The editor is Ronald Numbers, who is not a Christian. Okay? Not a Christian. So, great book. I highly recommend read this book. Each chapter has a different author, different historian. So you get all these different perspectives from all these different historians. You're not just getting one guy's opinion, you're getting all these historical perspectives. Here are some myths from the book that they debunk. That the rise of Christianity was responsible for the demise of ancient science. Okay, that's just false. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome didn't do science. They did something we could call proto-science, which is where it was more like philosophy. They sat around and they came up with theories of the natural world. But they didn't go out and do measurement. For example, you know about jaundice. It's the idea your eyes turn yellow. In some of the ancient writings, they would say, well, if you get jaundice, you see everything with a yellow tint. That's just false, and they would have known that if they would just ask somebody with jaundice. But they didn't do that, because that's not what ancient Greek scientists, philosophers were doing. Aristotle said women have less teeth than men. Ladies, how much teeth are you hiding from us? Okay, he would have known if he would have just checked. That's just false. They weren't doing science, they were doing proto-science. It wasn't until Christians came along that we started to do real science with measurement and study of the natural world. Another myth, that the medieval church suppressed the growth of science. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But yeah, this is just nonsense. They encouraged it every chance they could get. That the medieval church taught the earth was flat. Again, and we'll get to this, this is also false. As far as I can tell, there's only one medieval author named Cosmas that said the earth was flat. Here's one of I like to talk about. That the medieval church prohibited human dissection. They didn't. They encouraged it. They manuals were published in the 1300s explaining the anatomy of the body. Where they get this myth from is that there was some trouble with Leonardo da Vinci. He couldn't get bodies to dissect. And so there was a big myth that the church was prohibiting human dissection. No, Leonardo da Vinci couldn't get bodies because he had no scientific training or no medical training. It'd be like finding your local artist down the road who's dissecting bodies in his living room. You would be worried too, just like people were worried back then about him getting bodies and dissecting. He didn't have the training to. He was an artist. So yeah, Da Vinci did dissect bodies, but he had to do it secretly because he didn't have the training. Meanwhile, at universities that were run by a lot of learned churchmen, there was dissecting of bodies going on normally because they had the qualifications to. Here's another good one, that Giordano Bruno was the first martyr of modern science. It's this idea that this Bruno was this great scientist, and in Italy he was burned at the stake for practicing science. Okay, that's false. He wasn't a scientist. In fact, Bruno at one point scolded Copernicus for relying too much on measurement, not enough on mystic thoughts or intuitions. He was basically the Deepak Chopra of his day. He was a mystic. He had mystical ideas. He was part of a specific Catholic order, and therefore he was subject to them legally. Now, I don't agree he should have been burned at the stake, but he was burned for religious ideas, not for practicing science. There's a guy online, his name is Tim O'Neill. He's got a website called History for Atheists. He's an atheist. He has challenged atheists, his fellow atheists, saying, give me one example from the Middle Ages of anyone burned at the stake for practicing science. To this day, no one has been able to provide any documentation of that. No Christians ever burned someone for doing science. That's just a false claim about the past. Here's another myth in the book, that Galileo was imprisoned and tortured for advocating Copernicanism. The affair with Galileo is simplified, and it's a much more complex affair. Galileo was not imprisoned in his mansion, by the way, not in a jail, in his mansion, because he was practicing science. He was kind of a jerk, actually. He was tried because he was teaching Copernicism as it was absolute truth. And the church said, you can't do that. It's not proven. Known science. So there's that. Also, Galileo had some weird ideas. He was scolding other scientists for saying ridiculous, mystical ideas that the moon controlled the tides. He said, that's just basically magic. How could you believe the moon controlled the tides? I know. So there's a lot of myths about Galileo. Yes, he was a good scientist. He did a lot of good things, but he also had some bad stuff about him as well. It's always mixed with real history. So it's a lot more complicated history. You can check the book out. There's some other good stuff about it online. I can send you some stuff if you need to. Here's another one, that the scientific revolution liberated science from religion. Okay, this is false. The scientific revolution in the modern age happened because the church had been encouraging it for such a long time. Also, I hear this a lot. Mark Twain made this next argument. The church denounced anesthesia in childbirth on biblical grounds, because in Genesis 3 it says a woman shall have pain in childbirth, and they couldn't have that. They had to hold back anesthesia because of the Bible. False. As far as we know, there is no evidence of the church prohibiting anesthesia. In fact, they were fine with it. The objections to anesthesia when it first came out were from medical reasons. Some doctors were worried that if the woman is under anesthesia, she's not going to be able to talk about complications during the birthing process. It was all medical objections at first. It had nothing to do with religious reasons. This was made up. So, here's something Noah Ephron says. There's a chapter in this book called The Myth that Christianity gave birth to modern science. So it sounds like it's helping the anti-religious side. What he's actually doing in this chapter is he's saying that there were numerous factors that gave birth to modern science, and Christianity was one of them. It's too far to say Christianity was the only factor, but it was one. Here's what he says. Generations of historians and sociologists have discovered many ways in which Christians, Christian beliefs, and Christian institutions played crucial roles in fashioning the tenets, methods, and institutions of what in time became modern science. Today, almost all historians agree that Christianity moved many early modern intellectuals to study nature systematically. Historians have also found that notions borrowed from Christian belief found their ways into scientific discourse with glorious results. The very notion that nature is lawful, some scholars argue, was borrowed from Christian theology. So he's saying, yeah, Christianity wasn't the only thing that gave rise to modern science, but it definitely contributed. Another scholar here, Edward Wilson, says, of probably even greater importance, Chinese scholars abandoned the idea of a supreme being with personal and creative properties. Wilson was asking this question, about 2,000 years ago, China had more technology than Europe at the time. How did science, come out of European thought and not Chinese thought? They had so much more technology. Why did they develop scientific principles and scientific methods? Well, he says they had no rational author of nature. No rational author of nature existed in their universe. So consequently, the objects they meticulously described did not follow universal principles. So they didn't believe in this universal creator. They set up the universe with laws that governed it. Basically, Christians started to contribute a lot to the rise of science because they believed in a creator that spoke everything into existence and his word held everything together. Well, if his word's holding everything together, that sounds a lot like laws or principles we can discover and find out the way nature works, because God set it up to work a certain way. That helped give rise to science. Chinese thinkers and inventors didn't have that idea, so they never developed science. They just developed technological progress without an actual science understanding. So, I remember another historian, Joseph Needham, also found this same idea, is that Christianity helped give rise to science because they believed in a lawgiver. It wasn't there in China. So where does this idea come from that Christianity held back science for centuries? It comes from these two knuckleheads, Andrew Dickson White and John William Draper. They were living in the 19th century, and this is what they said. They put forward this thing called the conflict thesis. There's been this continued hostile relationship between science and religion. Why did they put this thesis out? Well, they were establishing a non-religious university called Cornell University. And they wanted funding away from religious universities like Harvard and Yale. So they created this conflict thesis. Don't donate to those religious universities. Donate to the secular universities, because we're the ones who really care about science and progress. However, today historians unanimously reject the conflict thesis, as far as I'm aware. Here's a bunch of good books. God's Philosophers by James Hannon, Science and Religion by Joshua Moritz. There's one in another corner called Dominion in the bottom right corner by Tom Holland, just came out. Great book. Now he's an atheist and he's calls himself like a cultural Christian because he realizes how much Christianity did for the rise of science and our modern views of morality and whatnot. A lot of this is rejected. Here's a quote from one of them. While some historians have always regarded the Draper-White thesis as oversimplifying and distorting a complex relationship, in the late 20th century it underwent a more systematic reevaluation. The result is the growing recognition among historians of science that the relationship of religion and science has been much more positive than is sometimes thought. Another good quote, the Roman Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy over 6 centuries from the recovery of ancient learning during the late Middle Ages into the Enlightenment than any other and probably all other institutions. So not only did they not fight against science, they were funding it. Okay? Now, John Heilbronn, I think that's how you pronounce his name, this guy's not a Christian. He's not an apologist for the Catholic Church. But he recognizes. So, if they were funding science, why were they teaching the Earth was flat? I mean, we all know about the Christopher Columbus affair. Did anyone learn that in school like I did, that Christopher Columbus discovered the Earth was round, and he was this great scientist and whatnot? Yeah, I was dumbfounded. I'm like, how could people think the Earth was flat? I mean, I remember watching Carl Sagan talk about how the ancient Greeks knew the Earth was round, and then Christians came along and thought it was flat until the Renaissance. It's utter nonsense. Okay, Christians who stated the Earth was round throughout the ages. Here's just a sample. So in the 400s, Jerome, Ambrose, Augustine, there's this time period that's commonly called the Dark Ages. A lot of historians don't refer to it now. We just don't have records of people talking a lot through that period on this subject. They were a little, worried with, Islamic invasions and Viking invasions. It was kind of a pretty bad time. But once the earlier Renaissance came out in the about 1100s, 1200s, everyone was saying the Earth was round. Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, even Dante in Dante's Inferno. He's saying the Earth is round. And he's not even a scientist, but he even agrees the Earth is round. Archbishops and whatnot. Again, only the guy I can find in the Middle Ages is named Cosmas. I'm not even sure he even would qualify as a scientist, but I would have to look that up again. So, here's something from modern historians, and it must be reiterated that with extraordinarily few exceptions, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC onward believed the Earth was flat. So, where did this myth come from that Christopher Columbus thought the Earth was round and the evil church tried to stop him? It comes from this guy, Washington Irving. Anyone know who Washington Irving is? Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle. He's a fiction writer and author. He was commissioned to write a biography of Christopher Columbus. So he looked into the history and found out it was actually pretty boring. Christopher Columbus just sailed and ran into a continent. So he invented this conflict. He invented this idea that he thought the Earth was round, and he was going to prove the church wrong. Because everyone knows a good story can be talked up with conflict. So he basically it's fiction. What really happened was, it actually makes Christopher Columbus look a little dumber than he was. They knew the circumference of the Earth. They knew basically roughly what it was. Christopher Columbus held to a minority school that thought the Earth was smaller. So he was like, I can get to Asia because the Earth is smaller. I'm just going to go west. And the learned men of the church were like, no, you're going to die in a giant ocean. And he would have if he didn't run into a continent in the middle. So it's actually, there was kind of a conflict with the learned men of Spain at the time. But it wasn't about the shape of the Earth, it was about the size of the Earth, and Christopher Columbus was wrong. But, if you're going to write a biography about him, you got to make him look like the good guy. So you change the conflict around. So let's get to one of my favorite myths. Did Christians burn the Great Library of Alexandria? Here's what we're told about the library. So it contained close to 500,000 scrolls. They'll say it contained this during the time of Julius Caesar, 1st century BC, 2nd century BC, that time. Contained all the knowledge of the ancient world. All the knowledge was stored in this one library, like we do today. Everyone knows we just have one library we store all of our knowledge in, right? Yeah. fanatical Christians burned this library because they hated science and learning. I've been told this directly by people on Twitter, because we all know Twitter is filled with scholars. And it set progress back for centuries. Those evil Christians would have burned the library. We've been so far advanced. So, we want to know how many scrolls the library had. We have to look at it. So Seneca the Younger says it had 40,000. Aristides said it had close to 500,000. Orosius, I'm probably going to pronounce some of these names wrong, and I apologize, said 400,000. Someone said 700,000. Someone said 54,000. Someone said 70,000. If you're noticing a trend here, no one agrees. There are wildly different numbers on the estimates of the library here. Okay, but people like Carl Sagan, a lot of people tend to repeat that it had close to 500,000 scrolls because some of them said it, but people like Seneca the Younger said only about 40,000. So how many scrolls did this library actually have? Well, we don't know, because as this one historian says, Diana Delly, lacking modern inventory systems, ancient librarians, even if they cared to, scarcely had the time or means to count their collections. They just didn't count them. They were busy doing other stuff. So no one would really know. These estimates are wild guesses or exaggerations just to talk things up. When you read numbers in an ancient document, be skeptical. I try to tell Christians this all the time. A lot of times what they're doing with numbers is not the same thing modern people are doing. It's very different in a lot of ways. So, there was a guy named Roger Bagnall. He's a historian, and he said, all right, I'm going to calculate how many scrolls the library may have had. So, let's say we're told there's 500,000 by the 3rd century BCE. Well, we know of about 450 writers from the 4th century BC. We know about 175 from the 3rd century BCE. Let's say each writer wrote 50 scrolls. That's high, especially for an ancient. That'd be a lot of different works. Josephus didn't write that many works. But let's say each wrote 50. Now we're going to do some little math here. I'm sorry for that. Sorry, Kelly. If each writer in these 2 centuries wrote 50 scrolls, that works out to about 30,000 scrolls. That's not 500,000. Now, even if there are more writers that we have missed, like you can double this, you get to about 60,000. You don't get 500,000 scrolls. Where are these numbers coming from? Well, other things you can do is you can calculate the size of rival libraries. Now, we don't know where the Library of Alexandria was, but we know where other ancient libraries were. So there was a library at the Forum of Trajan. It contained about 20,000 scrolls. Based on calculating the size of it, we can say it probably could have held about this many. There's another ancient library you probably never heard of called the Library of Pergamon. It was considered a rival in the ancient world to the Library of Alexandria. It contained based on its size, about 30,000 scrolls. Now notice, that's kind of similar to what Bagnall calculated for the Library of Alexandria. About 30,000 scrolls or so. So, I've seen some historians say maybe 40,000, 50,000 maybe. It didn't. These wild estimates can come from legends building up over time. Now, was it dedicated to science and all the learning of the world? Well, there's an easy way to look at that. We can look at the librarians that worked there. So the first guy his specialty was philosophy. The next guy, his specialty was in Homer's epics. The next guy, his specialty was biography and poetry. The next librarian, his specialty was poetry. The next librarian, his specialty was geography, followed by someone who specialized in textual criticism, and the final one, his specialty was grammar. A lot of scientists up there, am I right? Yeah. Anyone notice kind of a pattern here? A lot of poetry, grammar, and whatnot. What do you think this library was for?
Culture.
Yeah, culture. It was dedicated to the 9 muses. It was part of the Museum of Alexandria. That's where we get the word museum from, the 9 muses. It was a library dedicated to poetry, literature, grammar. They weren't doing science here. They were writing poetry. That's what they were focusing on. Sure, there were probably some scrolls that dealt with it, that dabbled into it, because there was some philosophy. And in the ancient world, science was a form of philosophy. But it wasn't the main goal of the library. The main goal was to honor the muses. So they probably collected a lot of poetry, specialized in some of Homer's works, that kind of stuff. This is not some sort of ancient science academy that those evil Christians wanted to burn down because they hated science. Not by any stretch of the imagination. So, what happened to the library? You guys ready for this? It's pretty interesting what happened to it. Very interesting. I'm going to tell you. What happened to the library was probably a lack of funding. The same thing happens to a lot of modern institutions. It wasn't anything epic. It's probably a lack of funding and some attacks and some pillaging of Alexandria. Rome went through several civil wars. So in the 200s, for example, the Emperor Caracalla massacred the young men of Alexandria because they were making fun of him. He was very secure in his masculinity, let me tell you. So they massacred a lot of the young men, and they plundered the city. The library would have been plundered, but also, after that, he cut off funding to the museum. Now, in the ancient world, you got to remember something, is that these types of facilities needed funding, generous patrons. Because, every scroll's got to be, there's no printing press, every scroll's got to be handwritten. So if you want a copy, you got to handwrite one. This is also before modern light. So there's candles everywhere. Things were getting burned all the time, over a couple hundred years. It wasn't the best upkeep. Scrolls were not made to last thousands of years. So things would get burned. So you needed a constant funding because you need people there working. And remember, not everyone in the ancient world could read and write. Christianity helped change that. But in the ancient world, there was only so many people that have to go through extensive training. So you have to have these professionals there, transcribing, keeping the scrolls safe. Eventually you're going to fall out of funding. Especially, and also your city's getting plundered. Again, in 274, Emperor Aurelian sacked the city again. There was a civil war going on, and they had joined the forget how to pronounce it, Primarian Empire for a little while. So he attacked and he reclaimed Egypt. Then it was sacked again by the Emperor Diocletian. Again, it kept getting sacked. What's going to happen is the library is going to fall out of favor. So we think right around the year 300 or so, the library basically came into ruin. It was no longer around. This is before Constantine, mind you. Before, a majority of Christians were there. So it just probably was sacked, lost funding, fell into ruin. Now, where does the myth of Christians burning the library come from? Again, with every good lie, it's got a little bit of truth in it. So, it probably comes from something called the destruction of the Serapeum. Now, the Serapeum was a temple dedicated to the god Serapis. He was like this Egyptian, Greek, synchronized god. There was a daughter library at the Serapeum for a while. Now, what happened, according to some church fathers, like Sozomen, is that he says there was this, I won't tell you this entire quote, I was just going to summarize it, so I'll paraphrase. There was this group of pagans that were mad at Christians because the Christians kept destroying pagan idols. So they started attacking Christians, torturing them, crucifying them, and they went to the Serapeum and they held up on there like their big base of operation. They sort of barred themselves in. And they were, killing Christians, torturing them for destroying pagan idols. So what basically happened is what we can guess. This is from James Hannam. It said in 391, a Christian mob attacked the Serapeum. They destroyed the pagan idols. Many died in the conflict because they were mad about the pagans hurting them and whatnot. The temple was converted into a church. But there is no mention of a library being destroyed in the conflict. At some point, the Serapeum had a library. We don't know if it was there at this point. But so you can see the connection being made. The Serapeum had a library. It was a daughter library of the library at the museum, the Great Library of Alexandria. So skeptics can say, well, if there was a library there, the Christians must have burned it. And then it just sort of grows into this fanciful legend that Christians burned the Great Library of Alexandria. Again, false. The library was probably destroyed before that due to pillaging and lack of funding. And the Christians just sort of attacked the temple. Now, you get mad at them for destroying these ancient artifacts, but you can also understand the rationale behind it a little bit. They were kind of mad about this pagan mob killing Christians. Also, pagan authors wrote about this attack on the Serapeum. They were very harsh on Christians. Never once did they say any library was destroyed. So no historian thinks Christians burned a library here because there's just no evidence of it. The pagan authors would have mentioned it. So let's talk about another myth that I like to talk about. Did Christians try to stop science because it threatened the belief in the young Earth? There's a lot of Christians today that think the Earth is 6,000 years old. I'm not going to get into that controversy. But the idea is that everyone thought the Earth was 6,000 years old. Darwin came, changed all that, and then Christians fought against it every step of the way. Now, as you know, history is never that simple. It's always a little more complex. So there's a great historian, Michael Roberts. He wrote one of the chapters in this book, Myth and Geology. He says, in the 1860s, there was a reverend named Richard Maine who wrote this. Some school books still teach to the ignorant that the Earth is 6,000 years old. No well-educated person of the present day shares that delusion. Now, even if you think he's being harsh on young earth creationists, he has a testimony from a century ago that there was a lot of learned people, Christians, that didn't think the earth was 6,000 years old. This is supposed to be the time when they're fighting against Darwin. Michael Roberts cites someone from 1785, before Darwin, someone named Reverend James Douglas, that promoted the earth was created in 6 expanses of time instead of 6 days. So long before Darwin, Christians were already saying, maybe the days in Genesis are like long passages of time or whatnot. Here's what Michael Roberts says. He says, Christian thinkers were open to slightly longer timescales before geological evidence was apparent. Despite the date of 4004 BC being in many English Bibles, a strict 6-day creation was never the dominant view and was the official position of no church in Europe or America until the late 20th century. Now we'll get to that until the late 20th century in a bit. But this idea that Christians were so dumbfounded when Darwin came along is just not the case. There was a lot of early Christians already thinking about this idea and thinking, well, maybe the earth was actually much older than we thought. Ronald Numbers says, in his book On the Creationists, he says, before the 1920s, even in the conservative South, dominated culturally by Bible-believing Baptists, a number of church-related colleges have been teaching the theory of evolution for decades. So before the 1920s, they're already teaching these ideas. So where did this conflict come? We see things like the Creation Museum. We see a lot of stuff in media like Richard Dawkins, Jerry Coyne, say that Christians teach the earth is 6,000 years old. That contradicts science. There's a war going on. History is more complex. So, Ronald Numbers wrote a really great book on the history of modern young earth creationism. Where did it come from? About 100 years ago, most people who called themselves creationists were either day-age creationists or gap theory creationists. So they either thought there was a gap in time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. It's a long, expansive time. Or they thought each day of Genesis 1 represented a long period of time. So that, if you look in, for example, the Scofield Reference Bible, it advocates for the gap theory. At the Scopes monkey trial, the creationists there were all old Earth creationists. None of them were young Earth creationists. But we're told this was a great conflict in American history between young Earth creationists and scientists. That's not what happened. About 100 years ago, there was only really one group promoting young Earth creationism. It was very much a minority view. The main person promoting it was someone named George McGrady Price. Now, he was a Seventh-day Adventist. He had no scientific training. Now, if you know anything about Seventh-day Adventists, they came out of this Millerite movement in the 1800s, where this Miller guy thought Jesus was going to return, so they all went on this hill to wait for Jesus to come back, and spoiler alert, it didn't happen. Shocker, I know. So some people left that movement and started the Seventh-day Adventist movement, led by someone named Ellen G. White. Now, she was claimed to be a prophetess, and she claimed she got a vision in the 1800s, where she was shown the earth was created in 6 days and everything was destroyed by a global flood and reshaped. So at the time, Seventh-day Adventists were the ones promoting young earth creationism, whereas the majority of Christians were not. They were holding to more old earth views. So this was what was basically happening for several decades. And then in 1963, everything changed. Two guys, one John Wickham Jr., who was a theologian. John Wickham Jr. Read about some Christians promoting gap theories or day-age theories or progressive creation, and he was angered by it. So he decided he was going to write his dissertation refuting this idea and arguing that the earth was young, arguing for George McGrady Price's ideas. Well, he wrote his manuscript and he went to publishers and they said, well, you got no scientific training. You got to buddy up with a scientist. So he tried to contact some geologists. Every geologist he contacted said, no, I'm an old earth creation. There was none. So he eventually found this guy named Henry Morris. Now, Henry Morris was not a geologist, although he's been claimed to be. He's not. He had his doctorate was in like engineering or whatnot. But he agreed to help write this book called The Genesis Flood. What's really interesting is Ronald Numbers got the letters that went between Whitcomb and Morris when they were writing this book. And they're going back and forth, and they're saying, you're following Price a little too much here. You got to pull back. People are going to make fun of us because they're just going to say we're recycling a lot of Price's ideas. And then it would turn around and the other guy would be like, now you're following Price too much. You got to stop this. So Price is relegated to a lot of footnotes in their book. But they published the Genesis flood, and it took off. They were great marketers. They had a great marketing campaign. Morris and Whitcomb were speaking all over the earth, pushing this idea. Out of the organizations they founded, we get Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International. Basically, that's when it goes. If you go back to the 1950s, the majority of creationists would have been described as old Earth creationists. So generally, what he's pointing out is that the modern young Earth creationist movement came about after sort of a pushback from evolution. In the 1920s, there was a pushback against evolution among Christians. At first, it was primarily an old Earth creationist push. Then in the 1960s, it became a young Earth creationist push. Going back into the 1800s, there was a lot of Christians who were open to Darwinian evolution. They were open to old Earth ideas. Now, even if you disagree, even if you're a young Earth creationist, you can't say the church was against Darwin's ideas or trying to fight them. They were sort of like, well, let's see where the science goes. We're open to new ideas. A lot of them are writing, things like, if the Earth is really old and if evolution didn't happen, all it means is our interpretation of Scripture is wrong, and we need to adjust our interpretation of Scripture, because a lot of them promoted this idea that nature was the 67th book of Scripture. Now again, there's a debate you can have in the church between young Earth, old Earth, evolution, whatnot, but it wasn't this idea all Christians were against Darwin. There was early promoters. Someone named B.B. Warfield called himself a pure Darwinist, and he called himself a fundamentalist. There was another early promoter, Asa Gray, promoted Darwinian evolution here in America. So, back to the general point. Christians have been open to all sorts of different understandings of science. They've been open to all sorts of different views and whatnot. They did not teach the earth was flat. They did not burn the great library of Alexandria because they hated learning, and they never held against scientific progress. They encouraged it, they funded it, they helped it as far as they can go. So there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that Christianity is anti-science. In fact, it seems to be a big promoter of science over the years. With that, I will conclude, not to overload anyone, and I can go into questions now. So, thank you, Al.